Okay, welcome everybody, ladies and gentlemen, friends. Those of you who are here with us on this quite wintry February evening in Jerusalem, and those of you sitting comfortably and warmly in your homes watching on Zoom, wherever you may be. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow here at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center in Jerusalem. It's my great pleasure to open this event and formally welcome everybody. This is the third event in collaboration that we've done with Gol Kalev, my friend, whose book Judaism 3.0 has inspired a lot of great conversations, important conversations, and debates about Zionism, Jewish identity, Israel's place in the Jewish world. One of the things I like about Gol and his approach is that he is not only is he not shy of argument and debate, but I think he even welcomes argument and debate. So I'll be very happy to hear some disagreement, but we'll see. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to tell the audience watching on Zoom that they can write questions into the Q&A little box at the bottom of the screen, and then when we get to the Q&A section of the evening, some of those questions will be put to our panel. It would also be remiss of me not to mention, given where we are at the Begin Heritage Center, that Menachem Begin would, I think, have had something pertinent and significant and nuanced to say about the debate that we're going to be, the topic that we're going to be discussing. He was, although he is obviously rightly seen as the father of the Israeli right, or one of the principal fathers of the Israeli right, and Israel's first right-wing prime minister, he himself didn't like to define himself as right-wing. He used to call himself as a liberal nationalist. And we're going to be discussing nationalism and also universalism. And Begin was both a proud Jewish nationalist who understood that nations provide individuals with identity and group solidarity and answer that very natural human need for belonging and a sense of some sense of collective purpose and solidarity. And he was also a classical liberal who believed in individual liberty and civil rights and freedom of speech, and that those things were non-negotiable. And he believed, in fact, to use the language of this event, that these values were universal. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing the conversation this evening, and we're delighted, really delighted and honored to have as moderator Chris Mitchell. Chris Mitchell is an American author and journalist who serves as bureau chief at the Christian Broadcasting Network News Middle East. For over 20 years, he's reported about Jerusalem, Israel, and the Middle East on his weekly program, Jerusalem Dateline. He established the CBN News Middle East Bureau in August 2000. Quite an interesting time to arrive in Israel. The Second Intifada, of course, broke out a few months later, which he covered, of course, along with other major events such as the 2006 Second Lebanon War, the Arab Spring of 2011, the rise of ISIS in 2014, the Abraham Accords, and the ongoing threat of a nuclear Iran. He also reported from Cairo's Tahrir Square, the so-called Arab Spring, the front lines of the battle with ISIS in Iraq, and he has told the story of persecuted Christians throughout the Middle East, a very important and underreported story, I would say. Chris Mitchell is also the author of several books, including Dateline Jerusalem, Destination Jerusalem, and ISIS, Iran, and Israel. Chris Mitchell.
Well, thank you. It was great to be here and great to moderate this panel for Judaism 3.0. So great to be with you. And in the months since Judaism 3.0 was published last year, it's sparked a robust conversation about the provocative question, where is Judaism today? It is Zionism becoming the anchor of Judaism, as Gol Kalev addresses in his book. The Jerusalem Report dedicated its cover to these questions, and in November, the Jerusalem Post issued a special magazine exploring the theses of the book, with various thinkers writing their opinions, including the president of Israel, Isaac Herzog. There's been conversations right here, as Paul mentioned, at the Begin Center. The last one here was on religious trends in Israel and how they impact the theses of the book. And the next one is going to be April 30th, and you're all invited to come for that. And that will be the question of our time: is anti-Zionism the new anti-Semitism? And they'll have two special toasts, like we had one tonight, but those will be a toast for the inauguration of Judaism 3.0 think tank, and then a toast for the 163rd birthday of Theodor Herzl, which will be on that day. So that's on April 30th. But tonight we'll place Judaism 3.0 in the context of global geopolitics, and specifically discuss how Zionism fits into the global debate between nationalism and universalism. And so our panel, as you can see here on the stage, is going to include a gal, along with Dr. Einat Wilf and Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem, Fleur Hassan-Nahoum. And here's a brief introduction to our panelists. First of all, Gal was born and raised in Tel Aviv. He served in the Israeli military, and then he spent 20 years in New York working on Wall Street as an investment banker. And for the last decade, he's been researching Theodor Herzl and Zionism, and that's the reason for the book. He's written numerous articles on Herzl's vision and how it's applicable today. He also writes about geopolitics, long-term global shifts, and Zionism for the Jerusalem Post and various international publications. He's also a board member of the American-Israel Friendship League and chairman of its think tank. And obviously, Kalev is author of Judaism 3.0, which is what we'll be discussing here tonight. It's a book endorsed by many, including former Israeli ambassador to the US, Michael Oren, Natan Sharansky, who wrote, "This book should play an important role in the discussions about the future of world Jewry and its relations with Israel." And in his book, he delivers the state of Judaism as he sees it, Zionism as the anchor of Judaism. And Dr. Einat Wilf is a leading thinker on Israel, Zionism, foreign policy, and education. She was a member of the Israeli parliament from 2010 to 2013, where she served as chair of the Education Committee and member of the influential Foreign Affairs and Defense Committee. Born and raised in Israel in a Zionist home right here in Israel, in Bet Kerem, right? Dr. Wilf served as an intelligence officer in the Israeli Defense Forces, foreign policy advisor to Vice Prime Minister Shimon Peres, and a strategic consultant with McKinsey and Company. She has a BA from Harvard, an MBA from INSEAD in France, and a PhD in political science from the University of Cambridge. She was a Goldman visiting professor at Georgetown University and a lecturer at Reichman University in Israel. And Dr. Wilf is the author of 7 books that explore key issues in Israeli society. We Should All Be Zionists, published in 2022, brings together her essays from the past 4 years on Israel, Zionism, and the Path to Peace, and co-authored The War of Return, How Western Indulgence of the Palestinian Dream Has Obstructed the Path to Peace. That was published in 2020. And I encourage you to look at her website as well. It's got great articles and interviews that she has on the website. And Dr. Wilf has become a roving global ambassador working with pro-Israel organizations around the world to tell the story of Israel and Zionism. And Fleur Hassan-Nahoum is an Israeli politician and policymaker, and she currently serves as Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem in charge of foreign relations, international economic development, and tourism. And I just saw her the other day, talked to an international group. She's also the co-founder and founding member of the UAE Israel Business Council. And Fleur was born in London, grew up in Gibraltar, the daughter of Joshua Abraham Hassan, who served as chief minister and mayor of Gibraltar. Her father and mother are of Moroccan and Spanish Jewish origin. Hassan-Nahoum grew up bilingual, speaking Spanish and English, and I think you have 2 other languages, right? Hebrew and French, right? Okay. In 1991, at the age of 18, Hassan-Nahoum moved back to London to study law at King's College London, where she served as president of the King's College Jewish Society. And after qualifying as a barrister in 1997, she practiced law in London and became campaign director of World Jewish Relief. In 2001, Fleur immigrated to Israel. She's married now with 4 children. So can you greet just... So impressive guests. So here's the format for tonight. Each panelist will share for 7 to 10 minutes, and then we'll follow by a panel discussion and then question and answer period. So have your questions ready, and we'll be taking questions from the Zoom call as well. And we'll finish at 9:30, and we'll start with Gal for his remarks, and then Fleur, and then Einat. Gal?
Well, hello, everybody. Thank you, Chris, for this wonderful introduction, and honored to be here with Einat and Fleur as a co-panelists. As Chris and Paul mentioned, this is the third event now that we're doing in the Begin Center about Judaism 3.0, every time exploring different angles about the general thesis, which is, in a nutshell, that Judaism is going through a historic transformation and Zionism is becoming the anchor of Judaism. I show in the book how both Jews and non-Jews relate to Judaism primarily through the prism of Zionism, whether it's in the positive or in the negative. Now Zionism has become the most relevant aspect of Judaism. And to explore this, we got to look at different Jewish arenas. We got to look at the way that the world deals with the Jews. But we also need to understand what are some of the global trends, because if we're asking what is the state of Judaism, as I'm asking on the cover of the book, then we have to first ask what is the state of the world and what are some of the main questions that are governing geopolitics today, and that is the topic today, Zionism between universalism and nationalism, as Chris said. Look, I mean, every century or every era has a arching global divide. It's not the only global divide, perhaps, but sort of like a defining global divide. In the 19th century, it was between monarchy and republicanism, this new idea of republicanism. In the 20th century, some of us remember, was between communism and capitalism. And what I'm arguing in my book and in my articles and in my website, europeandjerusalem.com, is that the defining ideological divide of the 21st century is between Americanism and Europeanism. Americanism is about nationalism, about particularity, about religion, about faith, one nation under God. In God we trust, which is on the currency and the official motto of America. Europeanism, on the other hand, evolved over the last few decades into the exact opposite, to be about universalism, to be about post-nationalism or multinationalism, about very, very aggressive advocacy of extreme secularism, and in some respect, maybe even atheism. Some might argue that the world's most fundamental zealous religion now is European atheism. President Macron, who maybe is the face of Europe now, said it quite succinctly, that nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism. So nationalism, which Americanism is anchored, is, according to Macron, a betrayal of patriotism. And so this is a defining, I think, ideological divide that we don't think about, because there's no, there's no wars, thank God. There's nothing that comes out of this divide. And America and Europe are great allies, and shared interests are way more important than ideological conversations. The war on terrorism, other geopolitical consideration, the environment. So it's under the surface, but as we know from history, things that are under the surface tend to get resurfaced at one point or another. And I think to think through this, we got to go back to the American Revolution. I just said that, we said, so the question is, where is Zionism and where is Israel? And I think, as we've seen in the Abraham Accord, that we see now, Israel and the Arab world are squarely on the side of the American side of this political divide, while much of Europe is on the European side, and also Europe spends, as we know, a lot of European euros, European taxpayers' euros, to advocate its messages around the world, including here to our Palestinian friends into the Middle East. But if you go back to the American Revolution, which is still, not that recent, not that long time ago, and not fully been settled, the American Revolution was not just about migration of a bunch of people from England and from Europe to America. It was about a transformative event, about a rebelling against all European dogmas. And as I argue in the book and in the articles, Europe has never come to terms with it, never come to terms with the idea that it's no longer the global dominant actor, and power has been shifted to its former colonies and primarily to the United States. one of the ideas or concept that America rebelled against is the notion of divine right monarchy. The notion that, that provided a lot of stability in Europe for 15 centuries, that God is the power comes from God, from the divine, but God appoints the kings, or the kings and the monarchs are representatives of God. And therefore, when there's wars, you can cycle back to peace rather quickly. And there is the monarchs are therefore related to one another. This was the system that during the Middle Ages and through the maybe 18th, 19th century governed Europe and provided stability. The American Revolution didn't rebel against the divine. They rebelled against the notion that the divine gives the power to the monarchs. Instead, at least conceptually, America became a divine right republic with the people. And which again, in God we trust, it is not a move away from God, it's just a notion conceptually that we the people, one nation under God, as we state, Americans say in the Pledge of Allegiance, is where the power is going to. Europe, on the other hand, moved in a completely opposite direction, because the European democracy today is an outgrowth, more or less, of the French Revolution. And the French Revolution, unlike the American Revolution, was indeed a rebelling against God and against the divine. They even tried to change the 7-day week and created for a period of time, there were 10 days in France, and other measures that were very, stating very aggressively that they are basically rebelling against God. So in a sense, you had two different narratives that have moved away from one another. So this is a divide, an ideological divide that again is not felt on a day-to-day basis in the interactions between Americanism, between America and Europe, but it's felt in the periphery. And one of such periphery is when it comes to Israel and Zionism. I had a conversation with a friend who's a senior European politician, and he was a little bit critical of my sort of harsh, what he viewed as harsh criticism of European treatment towards Israel. My view that, drawing on the writings of Theodor Herzl, that European opposition to Judaism is chronic, and that it just evolves based on changing circumstances, and now it's directed to Israel. He explained to me, and I take what he says, that look, this is not about Israel. This is just because Zionism is about Jewish particularity, Jewish nationalism. It is the reverse or the opposite of universalism. And many Europeans view universalism as a core aspect of what it means to be European. So Zionism is perceived by some as a negation of Europeanism, maybe in a similar way that in the Middle Ages, the fact that Jews can survive and be strong was perceived by those ancestors of those Europeans as a negations of some of the concepts of Christianity, like replacement theology. So now that European is secular and atheist, then now Zionism comes along and presents a counter-argument to Europeanism. And you got to wonder, what is it about Zionism that kind of provokes this? And it is, I think, exactly because of that it is about Jewish particularity. Because Judaism has been, throughout the history of Judaism until 100 years ago, to use our terms, a nation religion, meaning it had the glue of religiosity, but a Jew was within the Jewish ghetto, the Jewish grouping. A Jew in Austria wasn't Austrian, a Jew in Spain wasn't Spanish, he was Jewish. In the last 100 years, there was a new movement to try to denationalize Judaism that started in Germany and in Europe, but really took off in the United States during the 20th century. The attempt to reduce Judaism to the Jewish church, if you will, to a religion, to do away with the national aspect of the Jewish nation religion. And Zionism says the exact opposite. So if you believe in universalism or to one degree or another, then that is in your face, basically. Judaism is a religion and maybe inspires people. So if you're somebody who's not Jewish and you want to be inspired by Judaism, then why not go to a synagogue, do whatever you want. So again, Zionism stands in this contrast of the idea of universalism, and therefore in this debate between nationalism and universalism, it's not just a bystander, it's right in the middle. What I like to say, and what I say in the book, is that the world's oldest conflict is not the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and it's not the Spanish-Catalonian conflict or the Italian-Tyrolean conflict. The oldest conflict is the Israeli-European conflict that's been going on for 2,300 years, since the European invaders, the Greek and then the Romans, invaded Judea. Until that time, the wars that are described in the Bible and in our historical accounts and archaeology were about territory and taxes. But when the Greeks came, there was an attempt to negate Judaism. It wasn't about taxes or territory. It was about instilling those European values, if we can use those terms, of universalism. And the Jews refused. So this is the beginning of this, the holiday we're celebrating Tu B'Shvat today, but the holiday of Hanukkah marks the beginning of this European-Israeli conflict, if you will. And in a sense, at the beginning, the Europeans were successful at eradicating Judaism, at least Judaism 1.0. Judaism at that point was anchored in the physical presence in Judea and in Jerusalem and in the temple, which was the Jewish point of orientation. When the Romans destroyed the temple and kicked out the Jews out of Jerusalem and then out of Judea, they destroyed the infrastructure of Judaism. But Judaism survived because it's transformed to what I call Judaism 2.0. The synagogues replaced the temple, the ghetto, the insular Jewish life replaced the physical presence in Judea, and the ritualistic yearning to go back to Zion replaced the physical presence in Jerusalem. So this was the infrastructure of Judaism during those same 15 centuries that Europe at that time was operating under the divine right monarchy. Theodor Herzl, the visionary of Zionism, was born into that reality. And after going back and forth, he identified that this is not organic Judaism. The Judaism that he's part of is not part of organic Judaism. It is a Judaism that is reactionary to European persecution. In terms of geography, we get deported from here, from there, we go there. In terms of the professions that we're allowed to work, in terms of our behavior, in terms of our fear, we are what the ghetto made us. We are what is, to use my terms, this 2,300, 2,200-year-old conflict at this time between Europe and Israel has made us. And therefore, in creating Zionism, we planted the seeds for the transformation of Judaism. And what I'm arguing in the book is that this transformation in the 2020s are now beginning to come to fruition, and Zionism is becoming the anchor of Judaism. So this gets played out both philosophical, but also in a very, very practical way. Zion is an arena in this Americanism versus Europeanism, nationalism versus universalism debate of ideas. We know that for America, the shiny city upon a hill that many presidents, Kennedy, President Reagan, referred to John Winthrop sermon, is inspired by Jerusalem. We know that Americans, bipartisan from both parties, wanted to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. It passed with overwhelming, those resolutions, overwhelming majorities in Congress and the Senate. And many people, President Trump's constituents, explained to him that this is a core issue of what it means to them to be Americans, and put pressure on him to move the embassy, and which he did. And we're all grateful for the Trump administration for doing that. So on the other hand, Europe does moves that are in opposition to Jerusalem. For example, a number of European countries has voted on ludicrous UNESCO resolutions that suggest that Judaism and Christianity has no historic connections to Judaism. France apologized for its vote, but then voted again when a similar resolutions came to fruition. We also saw President Macron of France, that maybe, as we said, is the face of Europe now, come to Jerusalem on Holocaust Memorial Day and out of all days, walks into one of Christianity's holiest sites, the Church of St. Anne's, and chooses to disrespect it and throws a hissy fit at the Israeli security and police because he claims that this church belongs to France because of colonialist arrangements they've had with the Ottoman empires, which fine, but this just shows what all of a sudden, I thought France is against colonialism, but when it comes to trying to demonstrate its opposition, if you will, to Israel's rule in Jerusalem. He invokes colonialism and claims the church. So we see it play out in multiple arenas. The Zionism and Israel, as well as the Arab world, being more consistent with the American narrative. And that is something that's very interesting for American Jews. And I've lived in New York, and I speak to a lot of American Jews that are very critical of Israel. Many of them are readers of this book and engage in the conversations in the think tank and otherwise. And it's interesting because early on, American Jews were very fearful of dual loyalty, meaning being avid Zionist would be inconsistent with the American narrative. And they were not completely, I understand that. The American narrative was homogeneous, the Mayflower narrative. Today, it's the reverse, because the American narrative is intertwined with Zionism. America is a form of abstract Zionism. The narratives of the return. You have a lot of cities in America called New Canaan, New Jerusalem. So, and now being against Zionism is inconsistent with the predominant American narrative. And if you frame it in the European versus Americanism sort of debate, I'd say that if an American Jew wants to be consistent with the prevailing American narrative, he should celebrate his Zionist identity, celebrate his Jewish identity around Zionism. Also, for many American Jews, one of the most important values is that of tikkun olam, making the world a better place. And when Herzl designed the Jewish state, he designed it to be the tikkun olam state, which it really has turned into. Today, the Jewish state and Zionism is a light upon the nation. Innovations that are produced here are impacting the lives of millions of people around the world, ideas, the way we debate, the way we argue. And therefore, I would say that Zionism is at the epicenter of this debate between universalism and nationalism. But Zionism can also be an inspiration for providing frameworks to deliberate this debate in a safe and constructive way. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity. First of all, I think that I agree with the central premise that indeed Zionism has become the most successful anchor by which most Jews, and probably almost all, define their Jewish identity. It's very difficult to be a Jew today without having some position and even some kind of emotion, whether negative or positive, towards Zionism and the state of Israel. But I want to propose that the dichotomies come from several other directions, and they're also manifest in Zionism itself. So first of all, Zionism itself is, in my view, one of the most successful, if not the most successful, Jewish response to dealing with the questions of particularism and universalism in one response in the modern era. As I'm sure you know, Zionism emerges as one, and at the beginning, a very marginal response to what was known as the Jewish question. As modernity and enlightenment take Europe, the question is, can Jews fit into the new structure of the citizen of the secular republic? And the question of whether the Jews can be citizens of this kind of enlightened secular Europe ultimately becomes the Jewish question. And there are many responses. The Jews feel the pressure from many directions. One response, of course, is assimilation, is the excitement and the response of emancipation, the one known in the famous formulation of Udamit Gordon, the idea that you will be a man in the public sphere, so a generalized universal entity, but in your home, you will be a Jew. In your tent, in your ohel, you will be a Jew, but you will be a universal human being when you go out. So that was the promise of emancipation. Zionism is actually born out of the disappointment from emancipation. Haredi Judaism is a response to that. I always like to say that Haredi Jews are modern Jews. They like to present themselves as traditional Jews, but they're actually very modern Jews because their whole way of being is a response to modernity. It's basically a statement that says, if modernity is bringing down the walls, we are going to re-erect the walls in the form of how we treat Jewish law, halacha, the way we dress, and we re-erect the walls. But it's a modern way of being Jewish, the various reforms, and of course, Zionism. So Zionism essentially has three parents without which it could not be understood. The first parent of Zionism is, of course, the ancient longing of the Jewish people for Zion. A lot of people, especially religious people, make the claim, the mistake, perhaps genuinely or disingenuously, that this is Zionism. Sometimes I see on Twitter threads, Zionism is 2,000 years old, you know, the Jews. That's about the most ahistorical statement you can make. Because if Zionism is merely the Jewish connection to Zion, then why not a Jewish state in the 5th century or the 10th or the 15th? Why does it emerge in the 19th century? Why is it established in the 20th? If it's always been about this connection, if it's always been about this longing, what happened in the 19th and 20th century that made it then? So it's one parent, but it cannot explain what Zionism is. The second parent of Zionism is indeed the disappointment of emancipation. And no one experienced that disappointment more than Theodor Herzl himself, who believed in the promise of emancipation, believed that it didn't matter that he was a Jew, only to first experience it in Vienna and later in Paris, and to realize that the Europeans, as much as they claim universal ideals, at the end of the day are not able to live by those universal ideals, especially when it comes to Jewish equality and the acceptance of Jews as truly equal citizens and fellow members of the nation. So Zionism is basically born of the idea that Herzl says to the Europeans, basically, I got you. You have these noble ideals, but you can't really walk the walk. So you know, when we agreed as the price of emancipation to set aside the notion that we are a people, a collective, a nation, that was the price of being French citizens, right? To the Jews as individuals, everything shall be given, but as a people, everything shall be refused. So we agreed to put all our collective elements to the side. And basically Herzl says, that was wrong. We are a people, one people. Basically with that one line declaring a century of emancipation a failure. So that's the second parent of Zionism, the failure, the disappointment of the promise of emancipation. And of course, the third parent is the global, or especially the European, but ultimately the global transition from empires to nation states, which is a universal principle that is about particular nations, but the principle is universal. We begin the 20th century when much of the world is divided between empires. We end the 20th century when much of the world is divided between nation states, and when they're lucky, based on the principle of self-determination. And the Jews determined themselves to be a self, to be a nation. And that is the third parent of Zionism. If you only try to define one of them, they do not explain Zionism or the modern state of Israel. Only the three of them together bring Israel into being, which is why Zionism is at once particular and universal. It is the self-determination of the Jewish people, so particular to the Jews, but it is the universal principle of self-determination. It is based on the particular attachment of the Jews to the land of Israel, but it is based on the disappointment from the universal promise of emancipation. But when Theodor Herzl imagines the Jewish state, he does not imagine Jewish like Christian or Protestant or Catholic or Muslim for that matter. He imagines Jewish like French, Jewish like German, Jewish like English. The idea of a Jewish state is a secular republic that remains still the animating vision of Zionism. I have a colleague, when I used to be at the Jewish People Policy Institute, Shlomo Fisher, who writes beautifully. He once tried to explain why Israeli Jews and American Jews find it so difficult to talk about these issues with each other. And his thesis was that Israeli Jews are Catholics and American Jews are Protestants. And I think that's a far better explanation. He says that American Jews developed with the Protestant American vision of what a religious identity is, one where it supports the revolution, supports the expansion of rights, supports ultimately individual liberty. That's why American Judaism is ultimately a very American creation. And it's also the reason where America really became pro-Zionist. We like to tell ourselves the story that it was from the beginning. You know, often I go to the AIPAC conferences and they always say, Truman recognizes Israel 11 minutes after it's born, and then no one says and immediately declares an arms embargo. I'm saying, you know, with all due respect to Truman, the guy who actually helped Israel become a state was named Stalin, because without him, the Czechs would not have given us the arms that we actually needed to win. I mean, it's nice to get the recognition, but ultimately we needed the guns. So America really, really becomes pro-Zionist when we become what America likes, which is winners. Only after 1967 does America really become pro-Zionist, pro-Israel. This is when the American Jewish community becomes most outwardly pro-Zionist and pro-Israel, because this is the moment when it becomes the most American thing to be. And that's the key issue. The key issue, again, is to understand that the idea is to be American. So the Jewish identity is shaped by the American ideals. Israel, at the end of the day, and Zionism are a European creation. We are anti-clerical. We were established with the vision of a rebellion against the idea of clerical control, and this remains a key animating element. Zionism had to be a secular movement. If Zionism had not been a secular movement, there would not be a state. That goes back to the argument about the connection of the Jews to the land of Israel. If that's the story, we would still have Jews praying. Zionism had to be a secular movement because, to paraphrase, but not too much, the early Zionists are essentially going to the Jews and telling them that you've been praying for God to bring you back to the land for how long now? 1800, 1900 years. How well has that worked out for you? So Zionism is essentially a movement that says, we're done waiting, we're done praying, Mashiach lo ba, as they say, and we are going to be our own messiahs. Zionism is a secular movement of self-redemption. And this is why also it's a modern movement. This is why it's not a 15th or 10th or 5th century movement, because it's a movement that is based on the modern idea that people can shape their fate, that whatever cards were dealt to the Jews, they can actually change their fate. They can change the course of history. And that is the animating spirit of Zionism, without which we don't have a state. And that is the key element here. Now, I will say this, that my experience of talking about nationalism is exactly the opposite as yours. Americans don't understand nationalism. American Jews, when I try to explain to them Israel as a Jewish state, they think of it as an aberration. They believe in this universal notion of a nation bound by a constitution, entirely blind to the ethnic element of their nation. They spew the word ethno-national as if it's a slur, completely impervious to the idea that most of the world is based on ethno-national states when they're lucky. Otherwise, they just break down into civil wars based on the American Wilsonian principle of self-determination. When I speak to Europeans, maybe some of them detest the idea of nationalism, but they never misunderstand it. They understand it perfectly well. They might want to put it aside. They might no longer want to live by it, but they understand what it means, which Americans are completely blind to. So I don't know how much those divisions appear, but that's at least my experience in explaining it. So I'll end by saying that I think one of the reasons, if not the major reasons, that Zionism moves from being a marginal, insane idea at the end of the 19th century, where most Jews were either about emancipation or immigration to America, an entirely no Zionist vision, or communism or Bundism, all beautiful notions of how to be a Jew in the modern world. The reason that Zionism is the dominant, and really I agree with your thesis, pretty much the only idea left standing, is not that it was the better idea in theory in terms of arguments. All of the ideas, if you read the Jewish debates of the end of the 19th and early 20th century, all of them make a very strong case for why communism or Bundism or Reform Judaism or emancipation is the way forward. What happened is the verdict of history. The verdict of history was clear and cruel to all the other ideas. And ultimately, it only left Zionism standing, transforming also the Jews of America into Zionists, both particular and universal. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to see you all. I think I'm going to drill down a little bit into what the state of Zionism is in Zion, which is Jerusalem, as you all know. And, you know, for many, many years, I've taken part in many debates about this Europeanism versus the nationalism, Zionism in the mix. And I believe it all goes back to Greece versus Jerusalem, rationality versus spirituality. And I partly agree with Einat. But ultimately, I think the Jerusalem of today and the state of Zionism today is a mixture of both. We have not abandoned our rationality. In fact, we use our rationality every single day. But the connection, the spiritual connection to Jerusalem, and many of the early Zionists, I understand that Herzl was a secularist, but the connection to Zion from a spiritual perspective cannot be undermined in the reason why we came to Israel and not Uganda, in the reason why Jerusalem was our capital 2,500 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and continues to be our capital today. And that spiritual connection, and of course the role that the early religious Zionists had to play in the creation of the state of Israel, and even how some Haredim kind of decided to throw in their lot with Zionism at some point. Some did, some didn't. But the fact that some did is something that we cannot undermine. And so I want to talk about Zionism today in Zionism from a concerned citizen and public representative perspective. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and then I'll zoom out a little bit towards the end. And this is the state of Zionism today in Zion. The majority of our city, the capital city of the state of Israel and the Jewish people, Zion, one of 70 names of our wonderful city, is majority non-Zionist. And this is extremely concerning to me and should be concerning to all of us. And I'll drill it down and let you know what I mean. First of all, the city of Jerusalem is the largest city in the state of Israel. We're 9 million people in the state of Israel. 1 million people live in Jerusalem, so we're about 11% of the population. 40%, almost 40% are Arab East Jerusalemites, and 25% are Haredi Jews. So that is double the percentage numbers of the two largest minorities of the state of Israel. What do I mean by that? In the whole country, there's 20% Arabs and 13% Haredim. In Jerusalem, it's 25% Haredim and 40% Arabs. So that means that 65% of Jerusalem, Zion, our capital city, is non-Zionist. So I'm worried about that. And let me just tell you what's happening, and then we'll try and break it down and see if that really is the case, and mainly what we're doing in order to remedy the situation or what the future holds for the state of Zion. So first of all, I want to say that Jerusalem is the microcosm, to me, of everything. It's the center of the universe. This is my spiritual side coming up. I'm Sephardi Moroccan at the end of the day. But ultimately, Jerusalem is the convergence of everything. It's the convergence of East and West. It's the convergence of the past, the present, and the future, and is the convergence of heaven and earth. It's all here in the city. And we are a city of contradictions in many ways. And that represents also the main challenges of Zionism. But let's look at the situation right now in our city. So unfortunately, 38 to 40% of the city, they're Arabs. It's not unfortunate that they're Arabs. It's unfortunate that 85% are learning a curriculum, which is essentially the same curriculum in the schools that is being taught in Gaza, which, apart from the fact that is obsessed with the right of return, which Einat wrote an incredible book about the obsession with the right of return, the playing ground for that is Jerusalem and the educational system in East Jerusalem. So the kids in East Jerusalem are learning the same curriculum as the kids in Gaza, which is basically completely obsessed with the fact that one day they're going to kick us all out and everybody's going to come back, and that's what's going to happen. This is concerning. The city of Jerusalem has done a lot to try and remedy the situation. We've moved the needle from 92% learning this curriculum to 85% learning the curriculum by bringing in the Arab-Israeli curriculum that is taught around the country. What's going on with the ultra-Orthodox, the Haredim? Well, the Haredim, as a result of the same system that the Haredim and the Arabs have, the Haredim also learn their own curriculum, which stops teaching core curriculum subjects at age 11, but ultimately does not really teach any type of Zionist education. I did a master's about 15 years ago on conflict research, management, and resolution. And I've always been a little bit fascinated and obsessed with the Haredi community. And I actually wrote my thesis on the Zionist identity of the Haredi Jews. Now people are like, what? Zionist identity? They have no Zionist identity. So my premise to my thesis was there is a Zionist identity, they just don't call it Zionism, because Zionism is a dirty word in Haredi circles because it involves the secular revolution that brought about the modern state of Israel, which was not a religious state, of course. We are much more of a religious state than anybody believes, and I'm sure that many people would protest about. But that's the reason why the Haredi community resists Zionism. But ultimately, the bottom line is that in Jerusalem, almost 2/3 of the population are not declared Zionist. You can't compare the ultra-Orthodox to the Arabs because in the Arab community, of course, for the most part, there's an education which is poisonous to Jews in the state of Israel. In the Haredi community, it's a little less, but ultimately nobody really considers themselves Zionist. And in the city of Jerusalem, in City Hall, we have a situation where the Haredim represents 50% of city council and the Arabs are not representative at all because they don't vote in the local election. So where does that all leave us? So in my thesis about the Haredim, I came to the conclusion that the mainstream Haredi population, I'm not talking about the extreme elements like Natura Carta and the really anti-elements, are actually Zionists in different words. They are actually very connected to the land of Israel, which is really the first basis to Zionism. And the young people are actually moving towards the Israelification of their own community, which, whether they want to say the word or not, is Zionist. And also the Arab community is moving towards, I'm not saying Zionism, but again, is moving towards an Israelification of their culture. It's always very interesting to me that every time I get into an Arab cab, Mizrahi, Jewish music and Arab music are intertwined and nobody sees the difference anymore. And so culturally also the Arabs of Jerusalem are moving towards an Israelification. And what do we really do about all this? And what does this connect to Gol's book about Zionism? So ultimately, I believe that the movement that we all love, and the reason why I made Aliyah to this country 22 years ago, is alive and kicking. The resistance that we have from it internally and externally is kind of making us stronger on the one hand, and on the other hand, creating an inter-revolution within these populations that are, for the most part, declared anti-Zionist. So ultimately, I agree with Gol in his premise that today, the most, I guess, the most significant movement in the Jewish world, or for the last 100 years, has been Zionism. Somebody else, I read somewhere, there's two significant movements in the last 100 years. That one is Zionism and the second is Chabad. I have to agree, I have to say. But ultimately, what I want to say is that even with the very huge challenges we have, and the reason why the challenges in Jerusalem are, on the one hand, concerning, and on the other hand, give us a little bit of hope, is because the population of the state of Israel in the next 30 to 40 years will mirror the population of Jerusalem today. In other words, in the next 20 to 30 years, when you look at first grade intake around the country, we're looking at a country of a third Haredim, a third Arabs, and a third the rest of us in our glory, diversity, the glorified diversity that we all are. And so the state of Zionism today is something that we need to enforce. It's something that we need to take very seriously, not just how people perceive us in the outside world, but how we manage ourselves in the country. Because if we don't have our finger on the pulse, we are going to become a country which unfortunately is less Zionist than the Jews around the world. And so for me, it's a warning and it's a call to action that we cannot be apathetic about our Zionist identity. We have to be deliberate and we have to plan and we have to implement. And this is what we try and do in Jerusalem every single day. And my call to action is that we need to be proactive about our Zionism. Thank you.
Thank you, Fleur. A lot of rich material there to talk about. First, I'll start with you, Gail. You talked about Americanism, and just a couple of questions. Would you say that the support of U.S. evangelical Christians and the close relationship with the U.S. and in Israel is because of that Americanism? And also, a second question, you talked about the #1 threat to Israel bashing. How concerned are you about that, and how widespread is it?
I'll start with the second one. Yes, I think Israel bashing is an existential threat to Judaism and to all Jews, including those who bash Israel. There are statistics that the majority of anti-Semitism attack in the United States, I think 70% or 67%, are driven by Israel. So you have this bizarre reality that many Jews in media, through their pens or keyboards, bash Israel. Somebody reads it and attacks them or their children based on what they've said, which is completely unrelated to reality. This is not new. and this is exactly what Herzl identified, that this opposition to Judaism is chronic and just evolves based on global circumstances, or in his case, European circumstances and Jewish circumstances. Now it's directed, now it's not, the Jews, assassinate children to use their blood for matzahs, as it was in the Middle Ages repeatedly, and based on which Jews were, deported, and everybody believed that that's the case. And it's not that we assassinate monks, as it was in the 19th century. Europe, the French diplomats exported that technology of blood libels to Damascus, the Damascus blood libels. Now we assassinate journalists. And my friends in the United States and in Europe, many of them believe that Israel does that the horrible tragedy that occurred was planned by Israel. So, that's just one small example. But in the book, I draw an analogy between the early stages of the anti-Semitic movement. We like to use the word anti-Semitism for all of Jew hatred, but it was a particular movement that, as Einat alluded, the emancipation didn't work, and in part because there was a resistance to the emancipation by this movement called anti-Semitism. So I compared the early stages of the anti-Semitism movement in the late 19th century to the still relatively early stages of Israel bashing that exists today. And the parallels are startling, except Israel bashing is much more ingrained into mainstream culture and into the mainstream narrative. And that should be very worrisome, because Israel bashing has both a retail component, what I call occupationalism, the whole notion that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been hijacked, occupationalism is a form of white colonialism, in my view, because nobody cares about the Palestinians. They care about bashing Israel. But it also has theoretical institutional destruction mechanisms, which all of us are now under investigation, in case you guys don't know, by the International Criminal Court, which has a very broad investigation about potential war crimes and crimes against humanity by Israel and Israelis. I mean, people who served in the army, as we did, people, who maybe live in Jerusalem, which is considered a settlement by most interpretations of international law, not to mention the settlements. So Israel bashing is a very, very dangerous aspect, and that's why the practical implication of this book, that I'm arguing that once you accept that Zionism is the anchor of Judaism, you cannot hide behind this fake facade that you love the Jews and you hate the Zionists. We have an asset in this round of Jew bashing, and that is that it's not cool or not politically correct to say that you hate Jews. If you say you're anti-Zionist, that will get you promoted, perhaps. If you say you're anti-Jewish, that will get you fired. Once we create that equation, then I think Israel bashing mitigates. We also have another asset, which is exactly your first question, which is the evangelical community in the United States. It's not just the evangelical, but I think in the United States, there is strong support that is not driven by, it's driven by ideology. So certainly for Christians, when you talk to evangelicals, they always says, the verse, those who bless you are blessed, those who curse Israel are cursed. But it goes much, much deeper than that. And I do think it goes back to the essence of Americanism. Americanism is an abstract Zionism. And by the way, it is a bipartisan notion. There is a debate within the Democratic Party, and definitely within the Progressive Party. There are what I would call in my frameworks, European values that are trickling in including through the Jewish community, through college campuses. But Israel bashing is an existential threat, and certainly the support and love of the evangelical community is one of, I think, Israel's strongest strategic assets.
And a couple of questions for you. You do an amazing job on your website. It's called wilf.org, is that right?
Yes.
Okay, explaining Zionism and a number of other issues. Can you give for those that may be just new to this, a succinct definition of Zionism, why you spend so much of your time and effort in life defending it and explaining it? And last question, you said that Zionism is secular movement, yet Ben-Gurion said that the Bible was the title deed to the land. Can you reconcile that?
Certainly. Zionism is the political movement of the Jewish people for self-determination, you could add equality, liberty, in their ancient homeland. Each piece of that is critical, but that's the definition. So it's a political movement. It's not just some abstract idea. It's a political movement for self-determination. It has a specific goal that is ultimately to be manifested in state of the Jewish people, very critical, not of the Jewish religion, not of the Jewish faith, of the people, of the nation, and in their ancient homeland. So those are the elements. And if you look at a lot of anti-Zionist writing and speaking, it works to undermine each of these elements, from arguing that the Jews are not a people, only a religion, there's no connection to the land. A lot of these things are part of trying to take together those elements. But that's the definition, one line, quite simple. I think on my deathbed, I will know why I have devoted my life to that. I have to admit, it is more powerful than me. I sometimes feel like the guy in The Godfather, you know, just as I was out, they pulled me back in. So I'm thinking, okay, this year I'm going to write about other things. I'm going to do other things. And then I'm like, no, I have to write about this. You know? So.
But you grew up in a Zionist home, right?
But a casual one, you know, your classic labor, Zionist, Beta Kerem, secular, Mapai home. I mean, but it was just in the air. It was not like some kind of indoctrination. It was just how you were. In many ways, it's only when I was abroad and I engaged with people that I became more aware how non-casual it is to others. I remember when, as a member of the Labor Party, I was invited to address the socialist members of the European Parliament, which was about half of it. And I very casually spoke. I mean, I was supposedly their colleague, right? From Labor, a socialist party. And I would constantly refer to myself as a labor Zionist, and I realized they cringed every time I said that, and that I realized by the end that as far as they're concerned, it doesn't matter what I think about labor unions and wealth redistribution and public education. As long as I was a Zionist, I might as well sit on the fascist right of the European Parliament seating arrangements. So a lot of it came from the interaction with the world, with questioning why something that was so dear to me and clearly enabled. I do a lot of writing on feminism and Zionism and how they're very similar. And I could not be who I am without those two revolutions. Pretty much nothing that I am would be possible without those two revolutions. So for me, it was a process of questioning why is the thing that I believe was so beneficial and so good and so important is viewed in that way by so many others. And I think that quest is why I devote my time to it. My last book of essays called We Should All Be Zionists emerged from the understanding that Zionism has, apropos, not just a message to Jews, it has a universal message about, as I said, even being dealt with the worst cards, that victimhood is not destiny. That's a very important message of Zionism. I write a lot about, in the context of the Abraham Accords, the emergence of what I call Arab Zionism or Muslim Zionism. And I believe that would be the key ultimately to the next century, or this century as it develops into more peace agreements. So I think Zionism has an appeal that is much broader than just Jews. And of course, we see it among Westerners as well. And the last question.
The question about Zionism being a secular movement.
Oh, secular movement.
And the
so I always mention in my talks, I have a talk where I explain what it means to be the Jewish state. I go through the history of Judaism, and especially in modernity, the Jewish question and the challenge. And at one point, I mentioned that I'm a devout atheist. And over the years, I've made a point of mentioning that because I realized that if I told people that the idea that Judaism is a religion is a 19th century European construct intended to fit Judaism, into the secular republic structure of Judaism as a private religious faith, like so many people, especially in the West, believe that Judaism is a religion. It's a common mistake, which means it's common, but it's a mistake. And I realized that I could say that 100 times, but they will never believe me until I tell them standing in front of you is a devout atheist. And when I say that, I see the wheels turning. Like that's when they begin to come to terms with the fact that Judaism is a collective identity that certainly beginning in the 19th century does not necessitate faith. Now, I once mentioned it to a Christian audience. Now with Christians, I do it less because they're almost on the floor. Jews can take it, but so one of them came up to me at the end of the talk and she said, you know what? You might not believe in God, but God believes in you. And I remember kind of thinking of that and realizing that this is also what underpins religious Zionism. That at the end of the day, religious Zionism, except for the beginnings, but when it really emerges as a major force, basically looked at the godless communists of early Zionism and said, wow, it's pretty cool what they're doing, but it's weird that they are the ones doing it. So they essentially put on top of it the theology of all religions, that God works in mysterious ways. And unbeknownst to those godless communists of early Zionism, they were doing God's work. They were bringing salvation. And, you know, it's a bizarre choice on behalf of God to choose atheists, but all the power to him, right? Even shows more. So it's the notion that, and the irony, and I think by now we're entering the tragic part of it in Israel today, is that the more that secular Zionism became successful, the more religious Zionism was able to claim it as evidence, proof that God was really in the works. The 6 Day, and this is the reason that the 6 Day War is such a critical element, even though it's in many ways the epitome of the success of secular Zionism. That's when religious Zionism said, oh, this is God's work. This is, you know, the state of Israel, it's God's work. Okay. And for me, that's by now becoming a tragedy, because the reason we have a state is the secular spirit. And if we let it too much become the notion that this is a work of God's salvation, I think we're undermining much of what made this country successful.
Well, I know in 6 days, God did rest after 6 days.
It's not, that's the reason it's called the 6 Day War.
That's right.
That.
Yeah, sure. So, Fleur, you're an amazing ambassador for Jerusalem. Tell us what you do when you have, since you're with international relations, when you come and meet world leaders or visiting groups that come in, how do you explain Zionism to them? And why are you such a fervent Zionist? And last question, you're also being, and this ties in with what Einat said about sort of Arab Zionism. You're working in the Gulf states. And do you see them becoming, in some way, more Zionist?
Yeah, so my definition of Zionism is very similar to Einat, even though I don't agree with a secularism element of it. But I believe that it's a self-determination of the Jewish people in our ancestral homeland. That's the bottom line. And I, of course, agree with you that it was the secular Zionists that got the ball rolling. But today, the people who are fervently Zionists, I find, apart from exceptions, especially the young generation, are the religious, because it's a much, the spiritual connection, I believe, is giving the fuel to the engine of continued Zionism. And I believe today, the secular population is now beginning to think, especially with the kind of movement of, you know, after the 6 Day War, sort of the left-wing movements of why are we in Judea and Samaria. I think that the tragedy is, and you see it in the army, the kids going to the elite units today are the kids with a kippah on their heads, because religious Zionism is giving the gas to the engine of Zionism today. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that that emunah, that faith, that belief is today, I believe, the engine of the modern Zionism that I see. And that's a tragedy for me, that I feel that the new generation of secular Israelis do not have the same connection to the land as the religious Israelis do. And so we have to figure out how you change that. But I think that the numbers attest to that. Certainly, that's what we see in army recruitment today. In terms of representing Israel and Zionism, look, I always say to people this, you know, and I'm a chassidah of Einat's theory of feminism and Zionism. And the fact is that when you have a movement, you have a counter movement. And so the reason why feminism has is become a bad word, you know, is because there are people who don't want women to have equal rights. And the reason why, you know, they're anti-Zionist is because people don't want Jews to have equal rights or strength or any type of power in the world. So I'm a chassidah of her theory on that, very proudly. So what I say to people is, you know, if Zionism is the self-determination of the Jewish people in our ancestral homeland, and if you're anti-Zionism, then you believe that the Jewish people are the only people in the world who don't deserve self-determination in their country. And so that makes you an anti-Semite, because we're the only people who don't deserve our own country. Very much we are a people, not just a religion. We're a people with religion, with lots of things, but it's better to, you know, to focus on the fact that we're a people. And I agree that the whole religion thing is just fitting us into a construct. And I think Rabbi Jonathan Sachs said it best when he talks about the fact that anti-Semitism is a mutating virus. I think we now all know what a virus is. In the last few years, we've discovered it, and we know what a mutation is. And so, you know, the anti-Semitism is a mutating virus that starts off in the Middle Ages as something anti-religious, because that's the construct of the day. It continues in early last century as an ethnic virus. People are, you know, Jewish ethnicity, according to Hitler, we're a lower race. And now has evolved into the fact that we're a nation state, or we're a Jewish collective in our own land. And now people are anti-Zionist because they're anti our country. So again, anti-Semitism is a mutating virus. And that's why Gol's, you know, right on the money in terms of the fact that Zionism and Judaism today are intertwined into our identity as Jewish people. In terms of representing Israel, first of all, my best clients are the evangelical Christians. You know, they're already there. They believe that Jewish people, you know, came back to our homeland for a reason, for whatever that reason is. I don't get into it too deeply, but ultimately, in terms of where we are in the world and who our advocates are in the world, the evangelical Christians are our best advocates in the world because they believe the Jewish people should be in Israel. And because I'm a religious person, so it's easy for me to connect with them on a spiritual level, that Jerusalem is the home, the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, and the first capital city of the Jewish people. And to add something extra, you know, King David, you know, chose Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish people 3,000 years ago, thereby uniting a very split Jewish kingdom. So we're not only the capital of the Jewish people, we are the reason that we became a people from tribal nations, which we were before Jerusalem. This is why Jerusalem is so significant. And so to take that to the next level today, I truly believe, and this is what makes me a pluralist, that Jerusalem should be the place that every Jew should see themselves in. And if they don't, we have a problem. If there is a Jew around the world, whatever the denomination, whatever the way of praying, that does not see themselves in Jerusalem, then we failed. Because the DNA of Jerusalem is one of diversity and the celebration of the diversity of the Jewish people. And I really strongly believe in that, because the DNA was when King David, very smart politician, said, even though I'm from Judea, he was the king of Judea, to the capital of Judea is Hebron. Why did he pick Jerusalem? The reason he picked Jerusalem was because it didn't belong to any one tribe, and it was one place that everybody could come, gather, and feel that it was their place, and not that they were somebody else's home. And so for me, Jerusalem is not just Zion. It's not just the place and the reason we became a people that takes us to modern Israel today, but is also the place that should be a place where every single Jew should see themselves in. And that is really the core of my Zionism and my work in Jerusalem, to try and ensure that that continues.
And have you seen Arab Zionism in the last few years?
Absolutely. I mean, I created one just before the Abraham Accords were announced. My old friend and I created the UAE Israel Business Council because we realized that there was a lot of under the radar business normalization going on, and we wanted to kind of provide a framework for that. And so we created the UAE Israel Business Council 2 months before the announcement. We were shocked. I mean, we didn't understand it was going to happen so quickly. And once we did create the UAE Israel Business Council and the Abraham Accords were announced, I created with another good friend of mine the Gulf Israel Women's Forum, which is, I mean, to me, it's fantastic because women around the Middle East, women from Saudi, women from countries who haven't made peace with us, and women from countries that already made peace with us decades ago, like Egypt and Jordan, but there was never a people-to-people peace. And I'm not sure that there are definitely some Arab Zionists out there. I'm not sure it's a growing movement, but I definitely think we have some very strong advocates to the fact that anybody who looks at the map says, you know, it's okay for there to be one little Jewish country and for the Jewish people who are Semites and who are from this region to have their own country in this region. My biggest friend and advocate and partner in this is a guy called Ahmed Ubaid al-Mansouri, who created a museum called the Crossroads of Civilization Museum. And 15 years ago, he started collecting Jewish artifacts from the region. I mean, and it's very funny because before the Abraham Accords, the department of his museum was called Holy Land and Palestine. He couldn't say Israel. So it's Holy Land and Palestine. And he has literally just Jewish artifacts. And he's one of the first people in the Arab world to say, Jews are from this region. And I really believe, and this is where I get connected to my Sephardi roots, is that we need to begin to tell the narrative of the Jews that lived in Arab countries in this region. Because there's nothing that annoys me more that when a visiting president or prime minister comes, what does the government of Israel do? Where do they take them first? They take them to Yad Vashem, and then they take them to Herzl's tomb. I'm sorry, we've been here for thousands of years. Where is the expression of that in the narrative that we ourselves are telling? And the only way to express that is to talk about the Jews from Iraq, Syria, Iran, Morocco, you know, and the wider Jordan, you know, Egypt. That's really the only narrative that explains the connection to the ancestral homeland, which, as Einat says, is one of the parts that keeps getting rejected amongst the other. Peoplehood, and then the other thing is the connection, right? The only way to counterbalance the connection is to talk about the Jewish presence in the region, and the only way to do that is through the Jews from Arab lands. And I see Emiratis telling the story officially, even before we're telling the story in the state of Israel. We need to correct that.
Yeah. Well, we have time for a couple of questions. Is anybody here in the audience? And we'll take one from Zoom. Lily's coming right to you.
First of all, thank you very much for such interesting analysis and different opinions about the origins of Zionism and where we should be going. You've mentioned feminism. Two of you have mentioned feminism, and you've also related to, in other words, but I would say, the acculturation of the Arab population in Israel, also in Jerusalem. And I would add to that the acculturation of the Haredi population, particularly women. So recently, lately, in the last decade or so, my question to you is, how do you see the role of women and feminism in a change in our society for the better, for a pluralism of living together in some way, for a coexistence of some sort? and an integration of Zionism in all our society, how do you see the role of women, or do you see the role of women in promoting this in the near future?
Well, I'll start answering by saying that the reason that I co-founded the Gulf Israel Women's Forum is because I believe that if we're going to have a warm, sustainable peace, they should really let women run the show. And you see it immediately. Look, one of the things I'm most proud of is that the first ever physical meeting, because remember the Abraham Accords were signed in the middle of the COVID, the first ever physical meeting between Emiratis and Israelis was my Gulf Israel Women's Forum, end of September 2020. The picture went viral, and I'll never forget the picture of about 20 women sitting in a circle, some with a Jewish hair covering and some with Arab hair coverings. And there's nothing to be more significant and more emotional than that moment when I sat with all these women and we realized something very, I guess, obvious today, is that there's way more that unites us than what divides us. And I think the women have a unique talent in connecting pretty quickly. We talk more, that's just, fact. And so we tend to open up and bond quicker. That's just the way that it is. I mean, it's been researched that business women create more business through networking by 10% than men. I mean, I'm not inventing this. It's not a feely good kumbaya situation. It's actually, been researched. And I really strongly believe that women have to lead the charge of creating warm bridges, Jewish and Arab women. And one more little example before I pass on to Einat is that 3 years ago, I created a program in Jerusalem called Fem Forward, which is basically taking women in high tech in junior positions and trying to catapult them to senior positions, with the philosophy that women sometimes we hold ourselves back because we don't demand and advocate for ourselves to get higher pay rises and promotions. It's just something that Sheryl Sandberg speaks about. So we took the Sheryl Sandberg philosophy that women have to become our own advocates. And we created this program. And the first year of this program, we had it was always 15 women, 2 Arab women, 3 Haredi women, the rest, a mixture. Today, half to 2/3 of the women are Arab and Haredi women. And you should see these conversations. There's really, it's something to watch and to be proud of. The way that everything is put aside at that given moment in the course of 4 months, we are women and everything else is secondary. So I really do believe, and I'm a big optimist, that women need to take charge in this peace building and bridge building. And if we do, then it'll happen faster and better.
So I'll just say that no revolution is more substantial than feminism. The transformation of societies by any measure of welfare, societies where there's more human welfare are more feminist societies, where girls get educated, where women have equal rights, where women have control from their finances to their bodies, to who they marry. So that is by far the most substantial revolution to emerge from the ideas of the Enlightenment, of equality. I think Zionism is one of the most substantial in terms of changing the fate of the people. Both feminism and Zionism have transformed the situation of some of the world's longest oppressed and discriminated against people. That is why they are both transformational, they are not yet complete, and why they also face backlash. And it's no coincidence that the countries that are normalizing relations with Israel are the ones that are also trying to make the greatest strides. They didn't start from a great place, but they're making great strides in terms of the situation of women. I remember many, many years ago when people, many Europeans would tell me, why are you not integrating into the region? You're not doing enough to integrate into the region. I would say, as a feminist, I see nothing in any direction I want to integrate into. And that's changing slowly, but it's changing. The direction is very clear. And I think that will also transform the region, and what Fleur is talking about within Haredi and Arab society. That is the most important thing we can do, certainly for the state of Israel. So certainly the two most successful and unfinished revolutions.
As a token male on the panel, am I allowed to talk? Just very briefly. Haredis and Arab feminists. First of all, I agree with Fleur's thesis, if I understood it correctly. To me, Haredis are the poster child of Zionism, and it's a complicated and long conversation, but it's true. They don't call it Zionism. They have a criticism about the secular nature, but you know, when I go on Shabbat, because I'm not an atheist, to the Haredi neighborhoods,
So again, there's much misunderstanding of that.
Absolutely. Okay, so this was, you know, but because I believe in God and I want to pray to God, and I would like to do it, and I do it sometimes in all sorts of synagogues around Jerusalem, including in Haredi synagogues. And when I go to Zichron Moshe, which is like a mall of maybe 8 or 10 synagogues, minyans, and there are probably thousands of Haredis on a Saturday morning, you know, praying for the nation of Israel, yelling once a month at the beginning of the month, Kol Israel Chaverim, all of Israel is a friend. To me, that is a very strong postcard of Zionism. But the Haredi community, if we, you know, if you look at feminism, if we try to move away from European frameworks and the frameworks that we're used to, there's a lot of feminism in it, in terms of the power of the woman in the relationship, even in terms of like what percent of the family incomes comes from the woman. It is very high relative to any other sector and various other measures. On the Muslim side, just anecdotally, we went to the Kotel on Friday, and we bumped there into, we just started talking to a group of about maybe 10 or 20 Muslim women visiting from London. Some of them were wearing a hijab, some of them were wearing a burqa. And we spoke with them. They were tourists from London. And it just struck me that those women are safe in the Kotel much more than they're safe in Europe, because we've all seen those horrific images of armed French police approaching Muslim women that are dressed up in the beach and basically ordering them to take their top off. It's horrific. And there is a lot of, you know, in Switzerland, a Muslim woman wanted to get citizenship, but it was conditioned on having a physical contact with a man, a handshake, which in Muslim context, as in Haredi context, is something that is unheard of. Those women are safe under our framework of nationalism, particularity, Zionism, more than they were in Europe under the framework of universalism and enlightened European values.
Okay, Lily, let's take one last question from the Zoom audience. Sorry. And then if I can, I know we're just about out of time, but one final thoughts from everybody. All right, what's your question? You can, yeah, go ahead.
Jewish thought or fall after World War II, and Asian American Jewish have to take that this government power standing to the full right of this back to the tradition. How should we modern Jews living for all of that tradition, who's in the tradition, why would I that tradition essentially what
yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'll answer briefly because we don't have a lot of time, but let's not forget, where is Europeanism coming from? Well, I mentioned earlier that Europe invaded Judea, that the European-Israeli conflict that's been going on for 2,300 years, started when the Greek invaded here. And they were trying to un-Jew us, trying to fight monotheism and impose their paganic universalism value. But what happened? When the Romans came, after a few centuries, they ended up taking our values, our monotheistic values, and spreading it to Europe, to the Roman Empire, through Christianity. And then, Islam is the same thing. The values of monotheism, Jewish values, spread to the Middle East. So the whole notion of Europe, you mentioned some specific examples, but the whole overriding framework is basically taking Jews, the idea that Jews is a light upon the nations. That idea takes different forms at different times, but that light was spread to Europe through accepting monotheism, through accepting a version of Judaism, if you will, which was Christianity, and it was spread to Europe. I'm arguing now that Zionism is a light upon the nation, and rather than oppose us and be engaged with all those endless European opposition to all kinds of nuanced ways, resolutions, UN, things like that, follow the lead of the Arabs, of Fleur's friends in the Arab world, of what Einat was talking about, and benefit from the crisp light that is emanating from Zion.
Oh, you have one question up there?
Question. Our last question from Zoom is, why does universalist Europe seem to dislike particularistic Israel so much more than equally particularistic Palestinians?
So again, I don't think, there's a great book that I highly recommend by Tom Holland called Dominion, about how Christianity made the West. And we can only understand Europe as secularized Christianity and secularized religion. And to the earlier question, sometimes I do think that our greatest enemies are indeed from the Jewish people, from Paul to Marx. So Christianity and Islam didn't just take the idea of a single God. Their big claim, and the one that made them together responsible for half of the world's people, is that they untethered that one universal God that claimed universal jurisdiction, unlike the tribal gods of before. They untethered that universal God from tribe, from country, land, and from, at least for Christianity, from law. And the whole project of Paul, which ultimately become part of the human rights idea, part of communism, part of a lot of the secularized religious ideas, is that ultimately Jews need to become those universal, but universal is a Christian idea. What Tom Holland explains very well is that when people today use the word universal in the West, they are betraying their Christian origins, because Christianity claimed a universal mandate. That was the essence of it. So when people today use universal human rights, they're actually making a very secularized religious claim, which is why their problem then is with the Jews, because the Jews stand still connected to the ancient world. The Jews are a tribe with a God. In the ancient world, people have tribes with gods, but the Jews already belong to the modern world, because the God of the Jews has universal jurisdiction. That's why Jonah can't escape God. Jonah boards the ship in Jaffa because he thinks he's dealing with a God with a local jurisdiction. He doesn't understand that God has universal jurisdiction. What Christianity does, likes the idea, so it's not just about monotheism, it's about the universal God. But in order to expand, Jews cannot expand, we're a tribe. In order to expand, it untethers that God from land and from people and from law. And that's how it expands, and then that's how Islam expands. So the Palestinians are not a problem. The theological problem are Jews. That was the theological problem of Paul. That was the theological problem of Marx. And that's why we're the problem. And like you said, no one would care about Palestinian nationalism if it were not constituted as an anti-Zionist identity.
Yeah.
Very briefly to that, Lily, I think the question was, why are Europeans, universalists against Israeli particularity, not against Palestinian particularity. And I think the answer was provided to me by a Catalonian separatist that I spoke to a few years ago. And he said that in Catalonia, we have one problem, is that we're occupied by Spain and not by Israel. If we were occupied by Israel, the whole world would be pro-Catalonian and nobody will even hear of Palestine. So that's kind of echoes what Einat said.
Philosophical explanation. People don't like to see an empowered, strong Jewish people.
Yeah. So final thoughts, Gal, Einat, and Fleur. Gal, just your final thoughts for tonight.
First of all, thank you everybody for coming and tuning in on Zoom. I think we've touched a particular aspect of the idea of Judaism 3.0, but there is so much to cover, and that's why, as Chris mentioned in introductory comments, we are re-inaugurating the Judaism 3.0 think tank to address both the thesis, is Zionism becoming the anchor of Judaism? How is this reflected in Israel? How is this reflected with American Judaism? How does it reflect with trends in America where 80% of diaspora Jews live? And what are the implications vis-a-vis Israel bashing? If there is a final thought, is that, again, that we tend to talk about the negative, but there is so much that Zionism has to offer to the world. If we can get rid of the noise, and that's what I said earlier, anti-Zionism is anti-humanity. It is anti-humanity because Zionism advances humanity, but we can't advance humanity if we keep on getting this noise from Europe. There was a train from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem that got delayed by years because some Europeans had a problem that maybe like here, it comes to this territory, not territory, all kinds of things that Palestinians don't care about, but Europeans care about. So Zionism is a light upon humanity, a light upon the nations. And I think that the final thought is that we should not only focus on the opposition to Zionism, but use Judaism 3.0 as a framework to advance humanity.
To also answer your question on Ben Gurion, just to say that at the end of the day, the question is not just the one of the Tanakh as a deed. Ben Gurion, by the way, by saying that, was also making a complete claim against 2,000 years of rabbinical exilic Judaism. It's to say, okay, now we're the people of the Tanakh. What matters at the end of the day, a lot of people think they've owned me by saying, if you don't believe in God, you think God gave you the land, and you know, those level of argumentation. What matters at the end of the day is that the Jewish people told a story about a God who promised them a land. What matters is not the story. What matters is that the people constituted themselves for millennia and centuries around that idea. And that's what matters. What matters is the continuous element and the consistent element. And as far as I'm concerned, my way of being Jewish, you know, Mel Brooks once, I know, participated in some event and they said, you know, he's an atheist, and then he runs up to the stage and he says, but a Jewish atheist, it's a big difference. So at the end of the day, the key is it's not faith, it's not whether there's a transcendental God, it's, for me, am I part of a people who have told a remarkable story for millennia? And the way that I view myself as part of the Jewish people is being another link in the chain of continuing to tell that story.
Fleur.
Well, to me, Zionism is the greatest liberation movement, I think, in history. And the fact that, that we're literally a blip on a census in terms of numbers, and we've been tried to obliterate us again and again, and somehow we're still here to tell the story thousands of years later is nothing short of divine. And the fact that we're back is a combination of, to me, the divine and the will of the Jewish people to do for themselves. And I think this is the greatest strength of the Jewish people. It's also our greatest weakness. Our greatest strength is that we don't see the world as it is. We see the world as it should be. the other side of that coin is that we're never bloody happy. But that's why we're the startup nation, and that's why we keep pushing the boundaries, and that's why we keep innovating. And this is the Jewish story. We're not perfect, I always say this, but we should be really proud of ourselves for what we've built and for what we have yet to achieve, and that is a Zionist story.
So, Gal, the last question: how can people get in touch with you or know about the next one?
Well, first of all, you can visit the website. It's called Judaism/Zionism.com, Judaism-Zionism.com, sorry, or Google Judaism 3.0. Our next event here in the Begin Center will be on April 30th. And as Chris mentioned, like last time, we'll have a reception for those joining in person and not in Zoom. And for those of you on Zoom, you have, I guess, a few months to fly to Israel and use that as an excuse to come, because other than the Israeli wine tasting, we will do a toast for the re-inauguration of the Judaism 3.0 think tank. A lot of those ideas were developed when I founded and chaired the America-Israel Friendship League think tank in New York. I'm on the board, as you mentioned, of the America-Israel Friendship League think tank, and America-Israel Friendship League, and we created a think tank there. And that think tank is making aliyah and becoming a Judaism 3.0 think tank, and we'll toast for that on April 30th. April 30th is also a very special day. There is a relatively new holiday in Judaism, and that is Herzl Day. It's a holiday. You might have been in Knesset during that time. So if you were, thank you. I don't know if you voted for it or against it, but I'm sure you voted for it. Everybody voted for it. Great. So this is the Knesset legislated a new holiday in Judaism in Israel, an official Israeli holiday called Herzl Day, marking Herzl's birthday. And April 30th will be that day. So we will also toast for Herzl. So the next event here in the Begin Center, Judaism 3.0 event in the Begin Center, will be on April 30th. And the title will be a topic that we all alluded to here, is anti-Zionism, the new anti-Semitism. So details on the website, Judaism-Zionism.com. And thank you, Chris, for moderating, and Einat and Fleur for having such a provocative conversation, and everybody for coming.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Public vote.
Thank you, everyone. Chris, fantastic job moderating. Thank you very, very much. Fleur, as a citizen of Jerusalem, resident of Jerusalem, it makes me proud to live here, knowing you're deputy mayor and listening to you here. Einat, I've been learning and I've been being educated and inspired by Einat since we first met about 20 years ago. So thank you very much. And Gal, always a pleasure, of course.